Hey, St. John. Welcome to the Post Sermon Podcast. I am Deaconess Dahlia, and with me today is Pastor Adam.
Hey, Deaconess.
How are you?
Doing fine. How are you?
I'm good. Today we will be discussing your sermon from this past Sunday. What Trinity? We're Trinity 10.
Sure, that sounds right.
What was the text that you preached on?
This came from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19. And this is after the Palm Sunday account in Luke. And Jesus draws near to the city. He sees Jerusalem. He weeps over the city. And then he makes his way into the city, to the temple, drives out the money changers, and teaches the people.
What was the central teaching of your sermon?
Yeah, in the sermon, I wanted to focus on the promise that Jesus will make all things new, especially since the reading is focused on the destruction of the temple. I mean, just this historically awful moment. And we can think of other awful and terrible things that happen in history and how the world seems to continue to deteriorate and fall apart. The promise that the God who made the heavens and the earth, he'll make a new heavens and a new earth. He will make all things new.
Can you tell us a little bit about this siege in Jerusalem that Jesus is speaking about in Luke?
It takes place in 70 AD. The people in Judea, Jerusalem, they were a contentious group under Roman rule. At some point, Rome finally has had enough with the rebellions and the uprisings, and you get glimpses of this, like in Acts chapter 5. Some of the uprisings are mentioned. You know, Gamaliel brings up some of these things, or even think about Pontius Pilate. He offers to release Barabbas, and in one of the Gospels, he's called an insurrectionist. You know, some of his crimes. That there is this, it is difficult to keep the peace in this part of the empire, and Rome finally reaches a point where they've had enough, and here comes the destruction. And Jesus is reminding us that this destruction is tied to the people's unbelief. And so this echoes Old Testament history with the exile and destruction of the temple the first time, right, for the exile to Babylon. And so 70 AD is this other time. And so there are other historical accounts, like Josephus and others, that describe this more in detail. And also, depending on which side of the history you're on, which side of the battle line you're on, how that history gets written describes the events differently too.
And Jesus is weeping over this coming siege.
Yeah.
And you focus on his weeping a bit.
Yeah, and part of this was, if I asked someone, where in the Bible does it mention that Jesus wept? What would you say?
At Lazarus' tomb.
Yeah. It was just, probably just famously shortest Bible verse, Jesus wept, all this. But this is the other place in the Gospels. And then there's one place in Hebrews chapter 5. It talks about how the Lord cries in his prayers. And for a while for the sermon, I thought about kind of dwelling on those three places in Scripture. But instead of doing that, I went the direction I did because he weeps over a city, not over a particular person. Like he weeps over the death of Lazarus, and just kind of take that, all the way through was, the path I took with the sermon.
I really like how you talked about this destruction in Jerusalem and then brought up a destruction that we've dealt with in our lifetime, 9/11. So can you kind of walk me through your thought process about why you decided to include that in your sermon?
The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, my guess, does not resonate how deeply significant that was for Jesus and for the people of that time. And so what is something similar? And so thinking about the attacks on 9/11, especially thinking about New York City, right, and the sort of assault upon the country that was, and the lasting effect and trauma and memory of it. I was talking to one member during the week that I mentioned I'm going to make some September 11th connections in the sermon, and I did say, I wonder how much longer I can mention 9/11 in a sermon that it would still have that resonance, right? How many of the younger ones in the congregation it would have were not alive then, right? But I still think of things like I was not alive when Kennedy was assassinated, but I still had a sense of that tremor and feeling with how my mom talked about that. Or, you'd watch the footage of it. And so I'm still relying that as this sort of kind of a cultural feeling and mindset that 9/11 still has that sort of feel, even if I wasn't there, even if I didn't fully experience it, even if, I wasn't watching the news but it still has that weight. And bringing that up, I thought, was an akin example to what was happening here with Jerusalem in 70 AD. So that's the why.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that. I want to go back to how you brought up the weeping of Jesus, how it indicates that he's fully human. And I guess I just wanted to ask, why does that matter to us today that he's fully human?
Yeah. The sermon, I was really leaning into the incarnation, that Jesus is fully divine and fully human. And everything that Jesus does, he does according to both his divine and his human nature. And says the arrangement of the sermon, but you're bringing up the fully human piece. Why is that so important? He was like us in every way, and yet was without sin. Another Hebrews reference, he shed real blood on the cross for us, and it's blood that washes away sin. He knows what it's like to be human because he still is in his resurrected body. He knows what it's like to live in this sin-corrupted creation. And he wept. He's grieving. And the particularity of that grief here is over his kin, over his people who have rejected God, right? The people have rejected God's Son. And that is a grief that Christians wrestle with when we have brothers and sisters, loved ones who turn away from the faith. And that's a grief unique to Christians. And Jesus felt that too. And there is this being in the company of Jesus. We have good company in our commiseration and our continued hope and trusting that God's word will bring all to faith.
Well, I think in your sermon, not long after you mentioned how his weeping shows he's fully human, you bring up the question, what causes you to weep? And just like you mentioned, the grief that is unique to Christians when someone we love leaves the faith. We are now in the company of Jesus. So that was a really cool connection I don't think I had thought of in the reading. And I really appreciated how in the sermon you mentioned he was weeping, but then what does he do? He then goes into Jerusalem and he teaches in the temple. And this is kind of what you said, that for us as well, right? That we don't just give up in our grief.
Yeah, we do not grieve and give up, just as Jesus does not grieve and give up. And we know the word works, and God works through that word by his Spirit. And even just extending a little beyond the book of Luke, we had the book of Acts written by Luke. You have the Pentecost event. You have people coming to faith. You have all this taking place in Jerusalem, and then Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Jesus does not grieve and give up. And there's something beautiful to that, as for us as Christians, as we wrestle with this grief, is to validate and to come alongside and to acknowledge that grief and how heavy that is for those loved ones who have turned away from the faith, and not to be dismissive of it. Christ is not. And what do we do from here? And it's not some new formula. It is God will work by his word. He will work by the good news of Christ, who died for the sins of the world and rose from the dead, and bringing that news to the world. That is how the Spirit works to bring us to faith.
I love how you ended your sermon with that image by Rembrandt. So speaking of someone who had denied Jesus, I thought that was just a really good example for us. Can you kind of go into why you included that picture?
Yeah, I included that picture because the sermon and the text can have this feeling of talking about elsewhere, that city in Jerusalem, or, the city of New York, or those people over there, or those unbelievers, and all connected, right? And the sermon connects and relates to that. But even with ourselves, we are prone to wander. We rebel against Christ, and Peter is such a chief example of this. Rembrandt himself, even in his life as Christian, falling away and coming back and wrestling with his sin and all this, it just seemed appropriate to bring up Peter, and on top of it, he weeps as well. Since I was dealing with other passages in Luke that mention, weeping and Jesus saying, "Do not weep," well, here Peter does. And I was relying on, we also know that Peter's restored and forgiven and brought back into the family of God. And as much as we remember the night that he denies Christ and Jesus watches this, we also know that that night is not the end, right? There is forgiveness and reconciliation and resurrection and new life, even for Peter. And if for Peter, then for all of us and for those for whom we still appeal to with the gospel.
Yeah, Jesus is still making all things new. And we see that with Peter, how he did that in his heart, that his denial wasn't just the end for him. He received grace upon grace, even though it was undeserved. We were talking earlier about the sermon structure that you used. Could you go into what that was and what that sermon structure means?
Yeah, so again, we can organize a sermon in a variety of ways, and especially since I was thinking about the incarnation, that Jesus is fully divine and fully human. And I had this refrain, the weeping of Jesus shows us just how divine and human Jesus is. And I kind of had that as a sort of centering statement as I dealt with his divinity and his humanity. And so the structure is called paradox maintained, that you hold these two truths together, right? And we'll talk about this, that Jesus, what percent is he God? What percent is he man?
100%. 100%.
Yeah, 100%. And the math breaks down. He's not 60-40, not 50-50 or 70-30. He is 100% God. He's 100% man. And everything he does is according to divine and human nature. And so the structure is holding both of those truths there, not trying to reconcile them, but just hold them together. And so that's what the sermon did. First, I had the refrain, and Jesus is divine. I talked about that he knows all things. He's omniscient. He knows what was going to happen in Jerusalem. He knows what was going to happen a couple millennia later in New York. He knows all things. That's part of being God. And part of being God is that he will make all things new. So that was the first part of the paradox and holding that. And then the refrain again. And then talking about he's fully man. And we talked a little bit about that section too. And that he cries real tears, face flushed red and all this. It's not a metaphor. It's not just a fancy way of talking about God or trying to humanize God. No, God really became human and bled real blood for us. That's how real the forgiveness is for us. So the structure just acknowledges both sides of the paradox, holds them together, doesn't try to solve them, because if you try to or try to elevate one over the other, you're going to commit some sort of error or heresy. So that's how the structure works.
Thank you, Pastor. Anything else you'd like to bring up about the sermon?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts, just some of the resources I was looking at heading into the sermon. One comes from a devotional by Bo Geertz, and this idea of those who have turned away from the faith and kind of developing that. And he mentions in his devotional, he says, "No one can live on their father's faith or count on their piety. We must be converted. The call reaches us. It's not enough that our ancestors said yes once upon a time. It's not enough that we once said yes a long time ago either. Jesus is entering here and now, and his church is the new Jerusalem." And we see this throughout the history of the scriptures, this idea of handing on the faith. And not just because, well, my father, my grandfather, or my ancestors believe this, and therefore I'm in. Right? This is the common error that is made throughout the scriptures, but this faith becomes my own. Right? That that God has made me his own, that God has given me faith, and I trust in the promises as well. And this is hard, and this is part of the challenge of ministry and the work of the gospel and the life of the church, that there is this handing on to generation after generation. And so that's one thing to bring up. The other was, throughout the sermon, I had a sort of throwaway line, but I think it's interesting that if you want to go further or invite those listening, you want to kind of dwell on this, comparing Jesus to Jonah. I kept calling Jesus the greater Jonah. Often we talk about, okay, Jonah was in the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus in the heart of the earth 3 days, 3 nights. You have this death and resurrection connections, and but even how Jonah conducts himself outside the city of Nineveh. Right? Jonah looks upon the city of Nineveh with contempt and thinks of himself quite self-righteously. Jonah wishes for Nineveh to be destroyed, wants it, and he's upset that God is gracious and converts the city. Jonah goes through the city of Nineveh and preaches, and the city converts, repents, all the way up to the king himself. And then in contrast to Jesus, who doesn't look upon Jerusalem in contempt, but in sorrow and compassion, this longing that if only they would believe. And what does he do? He goes to the city and he brings the word and trusts that God will do his work. Jesus is the greater Jonah because he doesn't look upon those who have rejected him with contempt. He looks at them the way he looked at Peter the night Peter denied him. He looks at them with a sort of sorrowful compassion, a love that is often incomprehensible to us, that God would love us this way, that he doesn't just toss us aside, but he continues to bring his word to us to give us life. So Jesus, the greater Jonah, something maybe to dwell on further beyond sermon and podcast.
Yeah, no, that reminded me during BBS when we went through the crucifixion story, one of the kids said, Jesus must have been so angry when he was on the cross. And
interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting, and it kind of caused me to pause and push back a little bit on that. I think it's a fair thing to say, because I think if we had been in Jesus' place, we would have been really angry at what the people were doing to us. But when you read the gospel accounts, Jesus had that same compassion. He said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And there was definitely, it was love, right? Why he was on the cross. And there was, of course, sorrow and angst over what had to happen, but not anger. So I guess I thought of that when you were talking with just Jonah versus Jesus, how they were looking at the city of Nineveh and Jerusalem.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know I've brought this up elsewhere, and this is also why I brought up Peter. And it's because in Luke's gospel, when Peter denies Christ, Jesus looks at him and they make eye contact. And that's sort of dwelling on, how did Jesus look at Peter? What would cause him to weep so bitterly? It is a compassionate love. How does Christ look at us on the cross? Not with anger, but with his love.
Well, thank you, Pastor. This wraps up the episode for today. Thank you for listening to our discussion. In case you missed the sermon or you'd like to listen to it again, the link to the sermon is in the show notes. You can also find it on our church website, stjohndublin.org. If you, the listener, would like to submit a question about a sermon, please email us at podcast@stjohndublin.org. Thank you, Pastor, for joining me and for feeding us the word this week.
Thanks, Deaconess.
All right, take care, you guys. Bye.
Bye.